So let's begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the seminar today, organized as part of the Research and Publications webinar series. For today's talk, we have Vidya Vemireddy with us. Vidya is an assistant professor in the Center for Management in Agriculture here at IIM Ahmedabad. She finished her PhD from Cornell in 2019 and has been with IIMA since then. Her research interests are in the areas of agriculture, nutrition, food systems, transformation, gender, sustainable agriculture, and agricultural finance. She also collaborates with various government and other consulting agencies, including the Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers' Welfare's Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. Today, she'll be presenting her work titled Gendered Analysis of Time Allocation, Work Effort, and Nutritional Outcomes, which explores how involvement of women in agriculture impacts their nutrition. So over to you, Vidya. In the interest of time, maybe you can take only clarification questions during the presentation and keep all the meaty and chunky questions towards the end. So all of you feel free to use the chat box to type in your questions, which you could address after the presentation. And I request, in case there are any clarification questions that cannot wait, I request the participants to please use the raise hand feature. And in case Vidya misses the alert, I can moderate the same. So yeah, over to you, Vidya.
Thanks, Maya. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome all. This evening is a holiday and then you're here for the seminar. So I really appreciate that. To give a briefing of what I'm going to talk about, basically, this is building off my PhD work. So there are two pieces of work that I'll be presenting, one that is already published and one that is work in progress. But broadly, all of this relates to looking at how women spend their time, women and men spend their time in agriculture, what are the kind of trade-offs that women face and how that actually impacts their nutrition outcomes specifically. And then I kind of look at different patterns across seasons, across cropping areas or across crop, whether they have land or not. So all kinds of analysis is done over here, and then ultimately tracing the impact on nutrition. So with that, I'll start. So, why this topic, right? So one of the most important understanding so far in the literature is agriculture is key for improved nutrition. So improving nutrition, and that is because around 815 million undernourished people live in the world, and out of that we know that about 96% of them live in South Asia, and then about the rest of them in sub-Saharan Africa in total put together. But also something to note is that most of the undernourished people live in rural areas, which are predominantly sort of rural. The main occupation over there is agriculture. So therefore, the interventions in agriculture in terms of raising incomes or raising productivity or seed systems, or even if you go to more biological aspects of agriculture, trace back to health and nutrition of people involved in agriculture. And similarly, we know that is a population that is also suffering from malnutrition issues. And therefore, if you were to think of impact in terms of whom do we look at in creating that impact, that would be people within the agricultural systems to begin with, right? It's because there is a large mass of people that can be tapped into, and we can look at how their nutrition is getting enhanced and what are the various pathways in which it's getting enhanced. Now, if we ask why women particularly because they, especially of the reproductive age, 18 to 49 years, are the women who not only their health is definitely important, but also they hold the health of the next generation. So in terms of impacts and livelihoods, if you were to look at it, and actually maximize the benefits out of interventions, policies, etc., women hold the key part of this pathway from agriculture to nutrition. Secondly, we also know that women's nutrition in general, NFHS 4 and also now 5, which I've not represented here, we know that they're anemic, also a lot of micronutrient deficiencies are being suffered. I mean, women are suffering from those, and definitely we know that there rural populations, within the rural populations, women also form, like a lot of underweight population exists. About 36% of women are underweight, and most of them are in rural. In urban, what we're seeing today, which I've not sort of presented here, is that we're seeing obesity patterns also emerge in India. So we're seeing different types of malnutrition occur within different parts of India also. So with that, and the second piece to this, obviously we know that nutrition is, they're malnourished, women particularly, and why women are important. At the same time, women are also very important in the agricultural systems. Recent literature, which owes to looking at their basically the role that women play in agriculture, is pointing out towards more and more engagement of women in agriculture due to male out migration in rural areas. And secondly, they're involved in many physical manual tasks. I'll show you as to how that actually happens. And often their involvement is actually not something that is recognized across this literature, also evidence. So that is one thing that we need to pay close attention to as we design more and more interventions in this space, where we're looking at women as key stakeholders within the agriculture food systems. And now, if you like, how does agriculture affect nutrition? There are some pathways which Ruhl and Alderman in 2003 laid out. And one of it is obvious. So whatever you grow in terms of in your field is what you eat. So you access food, and therefore their nutrition might increase. The other is what you're growing and the income that you derive from there, from the sale of produce on the land. That goes on for then you can use that income to purchase nutrients from the market. Affordability is also defined. I mean, the supply side is defined by the agricultural system, so food prices. And three of the pathways actually relate to women in this, right? And one is the empowerment, and in terms of what the decision-making capacity of women is in agriculture, and how do they control the income, whether they can control it towards nutrition enhancing foods, etc., and also for their families, right? The second thing is their time, which is a very critical pathway, because they often in the development literature, we know that women are the ones who are not only taking part in productive work, whether that is on the field income generating activities, but also in across sociocultural contexts. They are the ones who bear the household tasks as well. So in terms of household responsibilities. So therefore, they're constrained for time, and that pathway is less studied in the literature. And that's where I contribute to, quite a lot in terms of taking it to the next stage. And the third part, which is also their health. I mean, this goes beyond just, time and engagement, but overall looking at their biological health that might not just be nutrition, but also broader than that through engagement. And this can happen through, the kind of physical environment that they have to go through, or the work effort that they put in terms of energy expenditure, and how that plays a role in their health. So these are different pathways in which Ruhl and Alderman has said that, they pointed out that agriculture can affect nutrition. And the key thing to note here is the involvement of women, and like three of the pathways relate to women. I've just given this graph to show you how the stunting prevalence occurs in India. Like you see, basically, this is district-wise maps of stunting prevalence within India. And then what you see over here is all the regions with less agricultural productivity overall and lower incomes are the ones that have like high child stunting, or 0 to 5 years of children, I mean, are stunted in these regions. And then wherever there is more development in terms of income, greater incomes, you see stunting prevalence going down. And this also relates to women in those particular regions because they are also underweight. So one of the regions that I choose for this study is Maharashtra, and I'll talk about that in length. And you can see that Maharashtra has quite a big distribution of stunting children, also underweight women. So what's the first study that I'm looking at is looking at this complexity of time, right? So how do they spend time in agriculture? And how does that vary across seasons? And with that, how do they spend time at home? Like, so in 24 hours, you're going to spread thin. You're working in the farm also, and you're working in the house also. And working in the house is a gender norm, is a socio-cultural context over there. Actually, is geared towards women. So women are the ones who are solely responsible for household activities, and men do not contribute over there. But men contribute to income generating activities, but not household activities. And therefore, you see that women have this time constraint that kicks in. So women are the ones who are basically uh, generating nutrition at home by cooking, etc., and also providing care for their family and providing nutrition for their family members and children. So that's the role that women are taking at home, but also are involved in production system in agriculture because they are working in agriculture, right? But does that mean that during peak seasons, like when we see that there is a time pressure from the agriculture, do we see that there's an impact on nutrition, like through the time pathway? Do we see that they actually reduce their time for cooking because they're time constrained? And does that impact nutrition? That's what I'm trying to tease out in this study. And this is published work. It was published recently in Food Policy, and if interested, you can look up the study. This was the concern that a lot of scholars laid out, that in multiple policy interventions, they saw that actually burdening women with more and more work can actually have negative consequences for their nutrition. But there was no empirical evidence that would point out towards saying that how this pathway is occurring and how these impacts actually show, because it requires multiple outcomes, and you will see the amount of work that is required. So, and also we need to look at it across seasons, not just at a cross section. Look at it, how it is working throughout the seasons within a year. That's number one. In the study too, what I'm looking at is this is absolutely new piece of work, which this is work in progress. But this is essentially, so when you're doing agricultural work, and we know from literature that women are involved in very physically intensive manual tasks within agriculture. So that means that there is, in terms of the physicality of it, there is an energy expenditure, the effort or drudgery, or there are a number of ways in which the literature describes this work burden, is expressed in terms of the calorie expenditure that women have. So energy, how much ever energy they're they're expending on these tasks. And that actually is linked directly to nutrition, because once you're expending and if your intake is not that high, on the net balance, you might see that your BMI could be affected, or generally your nutrition in terms of malnutrition outcomes, whether that's iron levels or zinc levels, could be impacted. And recent studies, so there's this recent study in 2020 in World Development by Piccioni et al., which basically showed using accelerometers. So this is an expensive technology where you use the watch, and they looked at women in India and Nepal, and they found that they are exclusive. Obviously, their work burdens are exclusive in terms of reproductive household work, and care work is exclusively borne by women, and they face these trade-offs. And they said, and other studies have shown that that may impact health adversely, but the link between the two has not been established. And that's what I've been trying to do. And again, the limitation so far in the literature is that when we look at women in these contexts, and especially using accelerometers, the sample size is reduced quite often, right? So here in this study, they looked at about 40 women. And that is, if you want to go beyond that in terms of inference, so then we need more and more methods to evolve to be able to say something conclusively in terms of whether that affects nutrition or not. So with these two studies in the background, what I'm going to do now is to show you the study area that, on the data that we gathered to do this, look at the study. So we have, basically I did field work in Chandrapur district of Maharashtra. So you can see here, which is toward in the Vidarbha region. And then you have three districts within that, three blocks within Chandrapur, which we look at, which are Korpana and Gonpipri and Mool. So these three blocks are essentially based on our formative work. We identified that these are the blocks where we require, where we have different cropping patterns. For example, Korpana has cotton exclusive farming. Gonpipri is more mixed kind of a farming system where you have like different crops being grown. Mool is completely paddy based. And why we needed this kind of a variation in the sample is to look at how time use patterns or how agricultural activities actually change across these cropping patterns, right? So that is the reason why, based on our formative work and excessive qualitative work, we chose these blocks, and under that we did a purposive sampling. We did a probability sampling, and chose about a total of 24 villages, and then 960 households. So I'll just take, yeah.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. If you could just click on slideshow, I think.
Okay,
Thank you.
is this better?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and this region also, just before we move on to the data slide, this region is also, representative of in terms of the national picture, where we have around 37% of women who are underweight, etc. And we also get the variation in cropping patterns. I'll come back to that slide later. So just looking at, so these three, so 8 villages were sampled from three of these blocks. And within that, 40 households are selected in each village. And then that makes it a total of 960. And then, this was done in 2014. And then there was a subsequent survey which I did in 2016. So, and we just got 954 households, about 6 households dropped out of that. And there were 3 surveys that were involved: a household survey, a recipe standardization exercise, and a time use and diet information, which I'll come back to in more detail. So how did the timeline look like for this kind of a survey? So if we look at between June and November 2016, I'm just taking you through this to see what it takes to get the outcomes that we're measuring in this study. So, and also it makes it more clear. So in the formative research, we did a lot of focus group discussions, triangulation, village level information, household roosters were collected, recruitment, training of the staff, everything was done around this period. And December to Jan 2017, the second household survey. So there was one done in 2014 by a colleague of mine, Soumya Gupta, and then I appended another panel to that in 2016, Jan 2017. So we did all these modules will cover agriculture input use, sales, storage of crops, etc. And diet recall, 24-hour diet recall, anthropometry, which is basically height and weight of women and men, and income and expenditure. So recipe standardization is something new that has been implemented in this field, where we looked at detailed, so we did details of, I'll tell you basically what it is now and then go into detail. We standardized about 502 local recipes for the nutrient intake that comes out of each of the recipe. And then we also collected time use data and nutrition survey, so which was done later in April to Feb 2018 of the same households, where we did 24-hour time recalls across 10 time periods. So every month, the same household was followed. So we started in April and then we went on till Jan, where each month we went to the same women once and took a 24-hour recall of the time use and the diet that she consumed. So we have 10 rounds of panel data based on that. So what was this recipe standardization of, and why did we need this, right? When we're looking at nutrient intakes, typically what has been happening is that every recipe in the 24-hour recall, we typically ask what the person consumed and what was the dish, and then detailed 24-hour recalls even go into looking at each and every ingredient that was used in it. But they, literature has pointed out that, there are measurement errors in that process. And the issue is that you can't actually get at the precise nutrient intake of, let's say, for example, if you're measuring tur dal, in that context, we won't be able to get the precise nutrient intake of that. So for that, and also there are a lot of local recipes that are consumed, which get often missed in these surveys. And we have no way to say that what is, the iron content, what is the zinc content, what is the vitamin A content within that particular dish. So for that, I followed a methodology derived by Gibson, and this was done in Harvest Plus as in a small context, but then I used this at a large scale for the first time, where we conducted a lot of FGDs, and you can see this picture on the top right, where you see a big FGD, which was split into smaller groups, and we obtained a roster of recipes that are being eaten in this. And we conducted many FGDs to get a roster. I mean, we had approximately 1,000 recipes at the end of multiple FGDs across seasons, festivals, non-festival days. So all kinds of recall was done. And we created that list. Once we had that, we removed the duplicacy, the ones that are getting used the same ingredients. And then we came down to a list of 502 where we needed to standardize. So within standardization, each recipe, we actually got the ingredients, gave it to women, and asked 3 women to actually make each recipe. So each recipe was made thrice by different women. And then if you see the top, if you see the lower right picture, and you can see here a scale, weighing scale, which is basically measuring the ingredient that is going into the cooking. So the woman is cooking over there, and you can see her dish. I mean, she's preparing, and we're measuring each and every ingredient that is going into the preparation of the dish. And we actually created a list of that, and it was average. And that's how we received, at the end of it, we had, for each recipe which is consumed locally, we had details of every particular nutrient. And if somebody is interested in how that then translates into nutrients, you can basically reach out to me, or in the Q&A. So that was done, and that's an important part of this. And the time use survey, basically, as I mentioned, the time use survey was done across 24 hours, and we did it in a different way than typically how it's measured. Usually we have about 30-minute blocks when we are looking at time use surveys, and we take a recall at what did you do from 6 to 6:30, 6:30 a.m. to 7 a.m., 7 a.m. to 7:30 a.m., etc. But how we went about in here was basically we started, when did you wake up, and then started taking primary recall and actually coding the time as the women said. And then we also recorded secondary activities, in the sense that, let's say I am in 6 to 6:30, I was actually making tea. That was my primary activity. But then I was also talking to somebody on the side. So that becomes my secondary activity. And then maybe I was taking care of my child, right? I was just overlooking my child, what the child was doing. That becomes a tertiary activity. So we collected data on all of those things. So we had primary, secondary, and tertiary to get at what the level of multitasking is within these households as well. If anybody has any clarification, you could probably raise your hand, because there's a lot of new things. So maybe if anything pressing, please let me know, and then I can stop and take questions. Okay, so just a brief of sample characteristics here. I mean, this is just representative. Typically, these households are somebody who own on an average 3 acres. The number of children are less. The household size about 4.42, like around 4. Access to irrigation is about 24%. Electricity, most of the households have. The quality of it, we don't measure it. Women's age, average is 36, and we only looked at women of reproductive age. Education is, there are about 33% women who have no education. So just going to the patterns straight up. So this is coming from qualitative work, and also while we did the survey. So just when we look at the patterns and agricultural activities that women do, so we map cotton and paddy because two of our blocks are, one is cotton, one is paddy. So when we look at cotton, we trace it from every month onward. So this is June to the next year's May. So we look at, she's involved in sowing, weeding and fertilizer application, land preparation, cotton picking, and cotton picking is essentially harvest of cotton. And then how does that go into April and May, where she starts looking at other forms of work. In paddy, she's involved, typically women is involved in land preparation, transplanting, weeding, harvesting, and other activities. I mean, I don't go into the other activities. They're like, in some cases, it could be marriages, religious-based activities, or other, basically non-income generating activities. Therefore, I don't mention it here. So when you look at the time use patterns, so just pay attention to this green one first, and then I'll take you through the other charts. So this, we've just tried to kind of create a schematic as to how a woman spends her time, right from 6 a.m. in the morning to the next day, 6 a.m. So basically, all these star marked are the ones which are primary activities, and then the ones that are not marked, are not in bold, are the secondary activities which she is doing. So typically at 6, she starts with cooking and personal hygiene. And then from 9 onwards, she's already involved in a lot of household related tasks, which are cooking food, eating and washing, ironing clothes, etc. From 9 onwards, we see agricultural activities pick up until 6 p.m. And then at 6 p.m. again, there's cooking, eating and drinking. In the secondary, people are saying that, okay, they do nothing or relax or socialize, etc. And then sleep. So these are just giving a sense. We've averaged out across all and then tried to create this schematic here. And when we look at the average time spent in agriculture and other activities by women, so here this is not 24-hour scale. So just this is minutes per day. We're just looking at few activities. Therefore, this is not 24 hours. But what you observe, pay attention to agriculture here is that she's spending close to about 333 minutes in November. And it goes to, I mean, it is quite varying, but on an average, you see that's about 100 minutes plus. And there are some peaks in July and October, November months. And then when we look at men here on the left side, we have similar patterns and a little bit more than women, but statistically not significant in terms of the agricultural time spent by men per day. So that is high. But just when we look at domestic work, that does not compare to women at all. It's quite small in comparison. So here, when we see a domestic work, cooking time plus domestic work, it's almost like 300 minutes plus a day that a woman is spending in that. And also socializing is and resting is quite high. This does not include sleep and rest, but socializing is quite high among men as compared to women here. So these are a few differences that just emerge just looking at the time use patterns. This is basically charting the same thing, but across time. And I mean, I just did the same thing over there, but maybe just to give you a larger picture. Now, when we look at energy expenditure, I'm clubbing both the studies and the findings in terms of the patterns. But when we look at the energy expenditures, and this is interesting how we went about creating these numbers. So in the literature, like I said, there's one study in 2020 that's been done, which is using accelerometers or the watches, which basically gives me a basal metabolic rate and then my physical activity level. And then that is definitely, like, obviously I'm using a tool for that. Here I have time use in my data, and I have the BMI of the women and men. So I thought of doing, using this available information and then creating the total energy expenditure between men. in men and women. So we use this formula, which is quite scientifically used. It's already published. This is basically the total energy expenditure is the BMR multiplied by, per each activity you have a bar, which is nothing but, physical activity ratio, and the time that is spent in that particular activity. So that's where the time use comes in. So we have a disaggregated time use. So we are able to, from existing literature, we got PAR values for each of the women-based activities and men-based activities in agriculture and non-agriculture overall, including sleep. And then we calculated the BMR using Harris-Benedict formula or Mifflin-Joe formula, which is quite common in this literature, and then calculated the total energy expenditure, which is probably the first time in this field of agricultural nutrition that people are looking at this. So here we're looking at energy spent in kilocal, which is the total expenditure. So you see that the first one is only for agricultural activities. So the peak is approximately 1200 kilocal is what is being spent in terms of energy by women. And then you see overall that, the red one is basically the women and the blue one is men. And you see that, it peaks in certain areas where it's around July and then another peak in October. But when you look at total energy expenditure, does not account for sleep, etc., but also just all other work, right? So when we look at that, we see a clear, because here the household pattern comes in.
Vidya, a quick question.
Yeah.
So these energy, it is not normalized, right? Like
it's not
for instance-
normalized. This is discrete actually, but we just plotted it.
Okay.
Like this, yeah.
So if, for instance, to finish the same activity, if let us say a woman took more time and spent more energy,
Yeah.
so that is not taken here. It still shows that they have spent that much energy, right?
Can you repeat your question, Maya? I just sort of.
So if let us say to finish a certain part of work,
Yeah.
the same work, let us say men took 100 units, and if women took 120 units,
Yeah.
it's not normalized per work. It still shows that it is 120 for women and 100 for men.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's different because this formula here is accounting for male and female differences.
Okay.
Yeah. So the BMR calculation accounts for that, and even the PAR is disaggregated by gender.
Okay.
And time anyways is a recall, which is differentiated, right? So yeah, so with that, I think, so if you look at all the blocks, I mean, that's the total sample. There is a difference, but then we statistically checked for it. But overall, if you look at it, there's not much difference in the total energy expenditures, but there's a clear difference when it comes to household work, and I'll show that. So when you look at household management only, so this does not include your socializing or any of the care activities, etc., but it includes mostly domestic chores such as cleaning utensils, cooking, all of that. And when you look here, there is a real big difference in terms of the energy expended between men and women. And this is where most of the literature has been talking about. But this first time I'm able to actually show you these differences. And here we split it by the block as well. If you look at it in terms of cotton crop, sorry. When you look at cotton crop and mixed crop, overall it's there, but there's just some fluctuations around it. And then the paddy crop. So what about, these were just time use patterns and energy expenditure patterns. But when I look at nutrition outcomes, so what am I measuring? So in the first study, I'm looking at nutrient intakes, which comes from the recipe standardization exercise. And in the second study, I'm looking at diet diversity and BMI. So diet diversity is a count of 10, where, and it includes 10 food groups, and it's defined by FAO. It's called the minimum diet diversity, and it includes food groups like vegetables and fruits, meat, fish, egg, poultry, cereals, pulses, and things like that. So there are 10 food groups, and you take a count. So if, let's say, if women is eating 3 out of those 10, so her diet diversity would be 3. So this is a commonly used measure in the literature. And the body mass index, we all know, it basically takes into account the age, height, and weight. So what are the patterns here? So when we look at nutrient intakes, so on the first row, you have the recommended dietary allowance, which is defined by the Indian Council of Medical Research. So we have, this is per day. So this is what a woman is supposed to have in terms of recommendations by the ICMR. And that's about 2,850 calories, 55 protein, etc., etc. And these are the ones that come from my survey using the recipe standardization exercise. And you can look, usually the calories are being met mostly. But when we look at other micronutrients, that is where the issue comes in. So most of the micronutrients are falling much below what is recommended, except fats, right? Fats and calories. You see, iron is very low, and then zinc, and then vitamin A, right? And then even protein. So even like a small dip with increased work and time constraints can actually have larger implications. And though the magnitude sizes could be less in terms of effects, but we need to keep in mind what is recommended and how they are already consuming. And that's where I think it becomes important that we trace all pathways. So when we look at calorie intake, so again, here I've plotted Korpana, these are different blocks. This is overall. So overall, so this is taking intake minus the energy expenditures, basically what is net. So you see that there is a dip. It is in negative in some seasons and it is in positive in some seasons. So this actually reflects that there might be some reason to believe that there is a difference that might occur in BMI because of this. So these charts give me that confidence. And the average BMI levels are 19.4 and underweight category according to WHO is less than 18.5, right? So they're just above the average and, average in terms of average, but obviously the distribution is quite large. The average diet diversity measuring in this particular sample is 3 out of 10 food groups are consumed. So typically it's around 3 in this area, that women on an average consume 3 food groups among the 10 defined categories by the WHO. So yeah, so when we move on, I'll just briefly tell you the results. The first study where we're looking at nutrient intakes and the time constraints and how that play in, we find that we measure the time constraints and time trade-offs through opportunity cost of time using the wages. And we find that typically there is a drop in almost all nutrients when we measure, including calories, proteins, fats, iron, zinc, etc. And they're significant in terms of the magnitude also, given that they're already very low. And it varies by cropping pattern, the cropping system, and that's the reason why we did also sample, right? Because there was a reason to believe that things might change according to cropping pattern. So when we look at cropping pattern, only cotton growing households, there's a less, the effects don't hold as much except in vitamin A. But paddy and the mixed crop regions have larger effects, negative effects. That means that basically the time constraints are playing a role in reducing the nutrient intakes of women, right? So, and then when we look at land size and divide a sample according to that, we see that the landless suffer the most. Landless and the ones who have small and marginal farms, actually the ones who have less than 3 acres suffer the most, and the landless. So that also is indicative of something of their work effort in that. Now, what is the mechanism through which this is operating? And my hypothesis is actually operating through time. And to actually tease that out, because there was significant amount of field work done. So my hypothesis was that evening would be the time when actually the nutrient loss is occurring. And that's exactly what I find here in terms of, loss of this thing, the loss of time. And that obviously affects. So if you look at the evening meal versus the morning meal, you see that the evening meal is the one where you're seeing maximum effects on nutrients coming. So this was the study that was done and it's already published. But basically the key takeaways in this is First of all, time is often an ignored pathway, right, in this particular area, but we show that time constraints do play a role into opportunity cost of time and how they actually link to nutrition, even in a rural context. So in the urban context, there are many studies in the developed world where we see that time constraints actually have linked to rising obesity levels, etc. So like that, you know, is true even for rural areas, and that's something that's a new insight that we bring in. And we definitely, this is the first study where we look at across seasons, and so therefore the peak season versus lean season inference comes in, right? And how my time constraints are getting very affected because of that. So that is the second table. And I already show that typically the nutrient intakes are getting affected through this time pathway. The broader implications of this I'll come after the takeaways from the second study. And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Second study, I'm not presenting the results as such, but what's coming out, because it's work in progress, is that agriculture work, the energy expenditure within agriculture. So what I'm finding is that agricultural work particularly, and the associated physical expenditure with agricultural work, is negatively impacting both BMI and diet diversity. But that's not the full story, right? So we not only look at energy expenditures, but we need to look at the intake as well. So when we account for intake, what's very interesting is that in diet diversity, obviously intake means more diet diversity. But in the case of BMI, intake does not play a significant role. So essentially, the maximum, the BMI is actually only getting impacted through my energy expenditure, and that too negatively. So this is something that is something that we need to pay closer attention to, because that reflects the work effort and the drudgery that the literature has been talking about, and how to reduce those in terms of strategies. Just a quick discussion and I wrap up and take Q&A. Basically, I think the first important point is to recognize and to map the overall women's work and within the agricultural system, and how they participate in various activities across time, and you know, what is the effort that they're putting in. And it's significant, and it's important to bear in mind the gendered needs. So here is a point which more and more literature is coming up, is that more as we think of interventions and policies in agriculture, we need to take into account these different trade-offs that are happening between men and women, right? So in women, this time trade-off is a critical issue that needs to be looked at. Otherwise, we might actually we want more women to engage in agriculture and also earn income through that, because that increases their empowerment. But at the same time, it's important to be mindful of the constraints they face in, and how that can negatively impact their health in the long run. So in that way, this study is basically showing that, you know, there are impacts which need to be taken into account. And the interventions and policies need to design these trade-offs upfront to be able to make sure that these negative consequences do not occur, and we see the benefits of the policies and programs coming in. And with that, obviously, the empowerment and their decision-making ability, the control over income are critically important. And there's a lot of literature to show that how women's empowerment plays a critical role, and time is a part of that, right? So this is where I think you know, the next discussion about how we need to be thinking about these issues comes in, both in terms of the energy effort or the effort that they're putting in, and as well as time. Also, you know, in terms of what to do and how to solve this, one of the things that's emerging but less understood is labor saving technologies for women in agriculture, so that, you know, the drudgery or the physical effort that is going into agriculture is reduced, and they're able to actually participate, increase their productivity, incomes, etc. But at the same time, do not have negative consequences of participation. That's where I end. And I think I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Vidya. We still have a couple of minutes, about 15 minutes. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and ask.
This is a small photo from the field, thanking my field team here.
Maybe I'll go ahead and ask my question.
Sure.
So I was just wondering, Vidya, so in the beginning, if I remember right, you also had data on literacy rate in terms of education. So I was just wondering, would it be possible to do a differential impact and see households which have women which are more literate, how different are the results that you see?
Right. So I did that, but I did not present, but not much over there, because I think it's more to do with the work in terms of time engagement than the education itself. And agriculture in general, in the nutrient intakes, it does not show up. So that's the reason why I did not present that. Yeah.
The second point I was wondering was number of children, because typically it so happens that as a mother, I mean, it gets distributed, right? Whatever limited nutrient food that you have. So would it be possible to see if households with, let us say, smaller or growing children, younger children, would that be interesting, and would it be possible to do that?
Yeah, it is possible. And I did that, because this was more agri and nutrition, I didn't present that. But essentially, what we see is that obviously the more the number of children and less the family size. And this actually method is accounting for fixed effects, which I did not talk about. So it's individual level fixed effects. So it kind of takes care of many things over there. Despite that, we see these results. But if we break the sample and look at the measure of the impact in terms of women who have more number of children as compared to women who do not. There I did see that there is a difference. And I think that's a good point. But aside to that, there's another paper that, that's my work, that we specifically look at younger children, mothers of younger children, and the kind of multitasking that is involved in their life and how that impacts their overall work burden and time. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I think Arun has a question.
Yes, that's right. Hi, Vidya. Sorry, I joined a little late.
No
and I found the results, the findings of the first study very interesting and counterintuitive, because common sense would suggest that when women are earning more, they would be spending more on food.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you found any evidence of women saving money for months when they are not getting any work. And is that why, and then saving, is negatively correlated with expenditure on food. So could that also be a possible reason that in the months or the days or weeks when they're earning money, they're not spending much on food because they are saving for worse times? Because you did find greater caloric intake in winter months when possibly there is less cropping, right?
Yeah. So no, so actually, Arun, in winter months there's harvesting, so it's linked to their wages, right? So during harvest, typically in many places, the wages are high, and so the women wages are obviously less than men. But so the results that you're seeing on the nutrient intakes are basically taking account the time changes, because they're fixed effects modeling. You look at peak versus relative seasons, and it is more to do with the opportunity cost of time and less to do with savings as such. Because what I'm finding, and this is what I'm thinking to do next, is actually see what is that inflection point of wage where precisely that the wage is useful as an income and less as an opportunity cost of time. So it's literally serving on the margin to them in terms of, so the wage is serving on the margin and not really translating into that nutrient purchase and intake.
Okay, thanks. So I had a related question.
Yeah.
So in the months when they're working and they're spending more time on labor, is it possible that did you also collect any data on food expenditure? So is it possible that they're spending just the same amount of money but purchasing poorer quality of food, so that is easier to cook food because they don't have enough time to cook? So is the expenditure remaining constant or unvarying, but the quality of food deteriorates in the months when they're working more?
Yeah, so that's the reason why you're seeing a decline. Food expenditure is more or less not that varying in these households. Okay. And I did collect food expenditure.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Hi Vidya, this is Debjit here.
Hi,
Sorry, I
Debjit.
joined a bit late, but
No
I had a more question, not only with the research, but more about, how do you do this large scale field study? Like, it's like you recruit these people. How do you gather these? Right. So,
Yeah, so I think that was challenging, and definitely, and I did present the timeline. It took me approximately 2 years to do this, Debjit, and it involved almost all the aspects of project management, where
okay.
I had to kind of recruit the team, train. This is the team in the photo that you're seeing right now,
Right,
but
right.
also sort of train them, and then design the surveys, questionnaires, and then execute it. And one of the challenges, and there's a blog that I've written on this, is collecting panel data, right? So connecting panel data is often very difficult because you need to visit the same households again and again, and you need to collect the same information. So there's a whole relationship that goes on, and how do you tackle different challenges that come in that particular scenario. So yeah, so it was a learning experience, I would say, but a lot of effort goes into first measuring the outcomes and putting that into question, also just making sure that the data quality is right upfront throughout.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Do we have any more questions? So if there are no more questions, we can call it a day. Let's thank our speaker. Thank you again, Vidya, for taking time out to present your work at the RNP seminar series. And thank you all for making it to the seminar.
Thanks a lot for being wonderful audience. Thanks.